Well, we're delighted to be here. And the American Jewish University. A whole Jewish university? It's a little different from my first experience with an American university. I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, a very ethnic community, full of immigrants. And I used to joke that Bayonne was 80% Catholic and 19% Jewish. And I thought Protestants were a tiny minority group. I thought they were some weird sect. You can imagine my surprise when I went off to Harvard. All his names on the buildings, not like around here, you know, all the Blumenthals and Goldbergs. I went up there and there were all these Elliots and Kirklands and Winthrops, all these crisp New England names with didn't end in vowels. It was an extraordinary experience for me. And actually, I at one point, but there was another guy named Steve Roberts in my class. Now, I'm not a real Roberts. You know, my real family name is Rogowski. Got changed twice. The ski got dropped at Ellis Island, and then my dad changed R-O-G-O-W, our family name, to Roberts when I was 2. And Roberts is a Welsh name. I mean, they're lovely people, but they ain't my people. And but everybody got confused at Harvard between the two Steve Robertses. So there were all these clubs, these very exclusive clubs that they thought of themselves as exclusive clubs at Harvard. And they kept sending me invitations to join. And I didn't have the guts to do this, but I would joke with my pals, you know, that I was going to show up with my invitation and say, guess who's coming to dinner? Stevie Rogowski from Bayonne, New Jersey. I can assure you that is not who they meant to invite. But tonight, I know you didn't mean to invite Stevie Rogowski from Bayonne, New Jersey, so I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to go from there. When Steve was at college, we met. Well, I was not at Harvard. I was at Wellesley, but we did meet the summer between our sophomore and junior years of college. We were 18 and 19. And it took about a year for Steve to get up the courage to bring me home. And then he did, and nobody was terribly happy about that. That went on for a while. Our friend Jeannie Furstenberg is back there. She was actually present for a lot of these conversations. There were sort of two conversations going on at the same time. One was trying to convince Steve's parents that, you know, I was really okay. The other was convincing Steve to marry me, which was a harder task. He says the way that he proposed was to say, "Oh, all right, Cokie."
Now look, I think this is pretty romantic myself, but she's only held a grudge for 45 years,
yeah.
So I guess I didn't do it right.
But at any rate, finally it all happens, and we are getting married, and it was we were trying very hard to make it a ceremony that everybody felt included, and so we got married at home, not in any religious sanctuary, and it was after sundown on Saturday night, and under a chuppah, and we had my uncle, the Jesuit, officiating because he had no choice. And we tried to find a rabbi, and we looked everywhere for a rabbi, and no rabbi would come. And Steve's mother says to me at some point in all of this, she says, Cokie, this whole search for a rabbi is really distasteful. I'm thinking, I'm the one doing it. She's not, but she says, so why don't you just, really in our tradition, it just needs to be a learned man. So why don't you get a learned man, like, say, Arthur Goldberg? And so we asked Justice Goldberg.
He was a friend of Cokie's parents. It was not out of the blue that my mother came up with his name.
And so he also agreed. And it was a huge wedding. There were 1,500 people there. And my mother cooked for the whole thing. No, that's a true story. Our daughter got married in the same spot 31 years later, and trust me, it did not occur to me to cook. And I said to my mother at that point, because I had never even thought about it when I was 22, right? But I said to my mother, "Why did you do that?" And she said, "It was cheap." You know. I also said, "Why did we have 1,500 people?" And she said, "Well, my father at the time was Majority Whip of the House of Representatives." And she said, "I got him on a grumpy night," which was easy to do. And she said, and I got him, said, "Hale, you've got to tell me who we're going to invite from the House of Representatives." And he said, "All the Democrats." And that was after the 1964 landslide, so there were more than 300 Democrats in the House. And so by the time we had them and some friendly Republicans and some members of the Senate and the entire extended family, and then we got around to people we actually liked, it was 1,500 people, which worked for Steve and me. We've been living on the presents ever since. But so I come tripping out the front door, and my nephew, who was not quite 5, who's now a lawyer in Los Angeles, looked around and says to my father, he was the ring bearer, and he looks and says to my father, "Papa, I lost the ring." And so everybody starts handing me rings, to walk down the aisle with. And I, in my full 22-year-old drama, queen moment, said, no, this is terrible. I can't do this. I can't go on. It's just awful, the symbolism of it all. And my father looks at me and says, "Cokie, don't you think there's enough symbolism going on here for one night?" So I guess we had succeeded in being symbolic. And by the time we got back down what passed as the aisle, the president's doctor had found the ring with his little ear light. And so Steve has his ring now.
Yeah,
and
there it is.
But as a result of the wedding, the Goldbergs took a special interest in us, and Dorothy Goldberg was an especially lovely person. And so the following spring, they invited us to their Seder. And they had a very famous Seder. It was, by this time, he was UN ambassador, and it was at the Waldorf Astoria. And I was mystified by everything that was going on until it came time to sing. And since he had been an old labor lawyer, it was all those songs that then became the songs of the civil rights movement. So I could sing. And but I learned that I really loved this holiday, and that I understood how important it was, and I wanted to make sure that it would be always something that we celebrated. But by the next year, we weren't invited to the Goldbergs. I don't know whether they had left town or we were off the list
I
or
think
what.
you sang too loudly. I think that was it.
But so I said to Steve, "You have to call your parents and tell them that they have to have a Seder." Now, this was a huge shock to Steve's parents. This was nothing they had ever done before, and it was something that you had a hard time conveying to them.
Well, absolutely, because I'm sure many of you would understand my family background. I would imagine some of you shared it. We were very strongly Jewish from a cultural and a tribal point of view, but not in terms of religious observance. And in fact, for a number of Eastern European Jews, my grandparents were all immigrants from what's now Poland and Belarus and Lithuania. Politics replaced religion. My grandfathers were Bundists and socialists and Zionists. One of my grandfathers, my dad's father, was an early Chalutz, a pioneer, a settler in Palestine. 1906, 1907. In fact, I have a picture of him working on the first road ever built in Tel Aviv, second road ever built in Tel Aviv. So that was the background. I mean, Saturday morning, my grandpa Harry went to the Workman's Circle, the Arbeiter Ring. He didn't go to shul, but that was his form of devotion. And so that was the tradition I grew up in. And so if you woke my mom, who just died last fall at 91, if you woke my mom up in the middle of the night and said, "Dorothy Roberts, what are you?" Should say mother first, and the second word should say would be Jew. But that didn't involve any kind of ritual. In fact, in many ways, my grandfathers in particular were anti-religious. So my grandfathers were never bar mitzvahed. My father was never bar mitzvahed. My uncles, in fact, I was the first male for many generations in our family who was bar mitzvahed. Now, because I asked to be. And I'm sure the presence and the peer pressure in Bayonne, New Jersey had a lot to do with it.
And you only had to do half.
Because I have a twin brother, so we only had to do half. Which, believe me, was a blessing if you ever heard us sing. But the fact is, I look back when I did a memoir a few years ago, a little book called My Father's Houses, and thought about this. And I have to believe there was some atavistic connection, some atavistic impulse that I was feeling even then as a 13-year-old to connect to tradition and connect to my history. And it was 10 years later that I brought home this Catholic girl to my parents. And so once we got married, and as Cokie said, she was really the driving force behind this return to ritual. My parents had never had a Seder. In fact, my mother used to say the first Seder she ever attended was organized by her Catholic daughter-in-law. And it taught us something very profound because, I have a twin brother, as I say, and I've made no judgments about the life choices he's made, but he married Ann Stein from the Grand Concourse, the Bronx. And the rabbis would have looked at the Roberts twins and said, the one who married Ann Stein did it right, and the one who married the Southern Catholic did it wrong. But if all those years, where was Judaism alive? Where was the parents come for Passover? They came to the Catholic daughter-in-law. So it's a profound lesson about how life does not always work out the way you think it's going to be, and your assumptions about the way it's going to play out do not always come true. And so, Cokie, my parents were kind of game about, they said, okay, we'll do this. And
Steve's mother had 14 menus. They'd start on a Monday and they'd go every day, and then 14 days later it would start again. Seder dinner was not one of her menus.
To say the least.
So she was not happy about this.
Although she always cooked the exact same thing every Wednesday night, which was when I had basketball practice. And it was sort of spaghetti with red sauce and fish. And whenever I see a basketball game, I smell fish. Because every night I ever went to basketball practice, that's what my mom served, because it was Wednesday. But in any case, we have this little Seder in my parents' home. They'd moved from Bayonne to Lakewood, New Jersey. And in the middle of this Seder, my twin brother called. I don't know quite why he called. And I heard my father, whispering into the phone, "We're having a Seder." and my twin brother said, you could hear him from Boston, "You're having a what?"
It's true.
And my father says, "Cokie wanted it." So that's how it started.
Then the next year we moved here. And I really, if I was going to have a Seder or go to a Seder, I realized basically I had to have one. And so we were living up on top of Big Rock in Malibu, and I went into Pacific Palisades and went to the temple and bought a Reconstructionist Haggadah and Seder plate, which I thought was a big commitment. I still have the plate.
Still have it? Still use it?
It's got a big chip, but it's okay. So I of course had the Maxwell House, classic Haggadah, and the Reconstructionist, which we call the Blue Book, and so we had a Seder. Well, much to I'm sure none of your surprise, there was a lot of kibitzing and people saying, "No, that's not the way we did it," and "No, I like it better with this part in," and all of that. So a lot of commentary. So the next year, I sat down and wrote our Haggadah. And really, that's basically been our Haggadah ever since. It became, over the years, covered with wine stains. There's these stapled together. And I typed it out on my old Smith Corona manual that was my high school graduation present. And and mimeographed it. You remember mimeographing? And then stapled it together, and we used it for many years. And it really did get to be kind of disreputable looking. So several years ago, Jeannie's son, Doug Furstenberg, who's our neighbor and father of our godchild, said he would...
married to Suzanne Brennan, by the way.
decided that he would spiff it up some. So I corrected to add some more gender-neutral, references, and added Sarah and Miriam and everybody. And he typed it up on, or had somebody type it up on a computer, so it looked much better, and put a cover on it, still pieces of paper stapled together, that said 25th Anniversary Edition. And everybody got furious. This is terrible. Where are the wine stains? It doesn't look like... Well, it took them about 15 minutes, and those were then covered with wine stains as well. So those are the Haggadahs that we have been using, these many years, now 40-some years. And we have traipsed around the world with them, but they became really something that everybody here among our friends got to know well and to really count on coming to our house for Passover every year. It was something that was very special to all of us. And so when we left LA to move to Greece, our going away party was a Seder a month early. The friends of ours hosted for us so that we could have a Seder with all of our friends before we went off to Europe.
So we arrive in Greece a month before Passover, really only a few weeks before Passover. And there we are in a new country with two little kids. They were 3 and 5 at the time. We were living in a hotel. We weren't even in our house yet. And so Cokie deputized me to go get the matzah for Passover. We were going to have a Seder, even just the 4 of us. We didn't know anybody. We didn't and anybody to invite. And she said to me, look, I hear there's an old synagogue down at the base of the Acropolis in downtown Athens, and so go to that neighborhood. Maybe there's a store selling matzah down there. I got busy, distracted.
Yeah.
Not the first or the last time this has happened. And just as I'm about to return for our little Seder, I realize I don't have the matzah. So I
had said to him, if you can't find matzah, get pita bread. It's unleavened. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would serve. Right? No.
I go into a pastry shop on my way home and bought a cheesecake. Now, I walk in and my Catholic wife says, "A cheesecake? What are you thinking? This is not kosher for Passover." I said, "It's Jewish, isn't it?" And she has still not forgiven me for that one. Still not forgiven me for that one. But we eventually made friends who we could invite to our Passovers as time went on in Athens. And one family was particularly good friends. And one of the traditions we always had, even when we first started out here in LA and kept up in Athens, was having a lot of interfaith couples. It was always very much a part of our Seders. And there was one family with very close friends. The dad in the family was a Jew from Chicago, was a foreign service officer in the American embassy, and in his first foreign posting, he had met and married this gorgeous young Brazilian Catholic woman, and so their kids were the same ages as our kids in the same school, and so the Friedmans, in fact, to this day, the Friedmans are still part of our Seders. And so at the time, they had a 3-year-old, Alicia. She's now a very competent adult, but she was a kind of an incompetent 3-year-old. And
she was 3.
And she was kind of a space case. So when it came time to, send someone out for Elijah, we sent out Alicia. And she didn't come back.
It's true.
And we're waiting around, where is this child? And finally, she sort of wanders back in and I said, well, Lisa, did you see Elijah? No, she says, but I saw God, which was one of the high points of our Seders over the years. But then the next year, our son Lee, who now also a very competent adult, but he was sent out, and Elijah didn't show up again, right? I mean, this is confusing to kids, right? So it's a bit like, staying up for Santa Claus and he doesn't come. It's confusing.
He eventually comes.
So Lee pulls me aside. He's 5 or 6 at the time. He pulls me aside and says, Daddy, when you were a little kid and both of your parents were Jewish, did Elijah come to your house? He thought Elijah was boycotting the shiksa, you know.
That's true. That is what he thought. But so then we came back to Washington, and we started having, seders that just kept growing. And of course now they're really growing because all those children are now grown up and have children. So we outgrew any room, where you could just sort of normally sit at a dining room table or a couple of tables. And now we empty the glassed-in porch of the furniture and set up these rented long rectangular tables so it looks for all the world like a VFW hall. It really does, but it's still an occasion that we love having everybody there for. And Steve's parents especially love coming, and they used to plan their trips. They would go to Florida in the winter and New Jersey in the rest of the year, and so they would plan their trips north around Passover. And my mother always came as well, except for the years when she was the ambassador to the Vatican. And those years...
I am the only Jewish guy from Bayonne, New Jersey, whose mother-in-law was the ambassador to the Vatican. I can promise. This I know for a fact.
Of course, my mother went at age 81 to take this new job at the Vatican. She just turned 95 on Sunday. And we were all thrilled when she went, go to Rome all the time. But then what happened here happened, and she found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope, which of course turned out to be the toughest job in the diplomatic service. But if anybody could do it, Mama could. And she did it beautifully and then came home, where she is now still a regular at our seders. And they have really been something that give us great joy and give our friends a great amount of joy.
And one of the reasons why we did the Haggadah and published it, and it's funny, as we've been traveling, people come up to us and say, we have our own Haggadah too. I'm sure there are many of you have. And that's the nature of Passover. We call this book our Haggadah, but in many ways it could be called your Haggadah. Because the great joy of this holiday is that it's so accessible. And you don't have to contribute to the building fund and buy tickets. And this is a Jewish holiday where you can do it at home and do it on your own terms. And one of the things that's happened to us as a fairly visible interfaith couple over the years is how many young people, and one of my wonderful former students, Lonnie Giamella, is in the back. In fact, I endowed a prize at the university, at George Washington University, in the name of my parents, and Lonnie was one of the winners some years ago with this prize. And one of the things I learned from my students was that many of them were in interfaith relationships, many of them increasingly in interracial relationships. 1 out of 7 American marriages these days are interracial, probably higher in LA. They were hungry for models. They were hungry for encouragement. Because the official figures in their lives, the pastors, the priests, the rabbis, their parents, their community leaders, all were pulling them apart. They were telling them this was not possible. And so they were very eager to have a conversation about what could they do to make this work. And we did an earlier book about 10 years ago called From This Day Forward, which was about the whole journey we've made together as an interfaith couple. But the Haggadah in many ways was one of the reasons why we did this was because, as I say, if you have a young couple who wants to return or reconnect to Judaism, this is one of the best ways to do it. It's a wonderful entry point. And truth is, I'm sure many of you know this as well, that it's not just the non-Jewish spouse who can be confused about this holiday. There are plenty of young kids who were raised, quote, Jewish, but never had, secular Jews, never had an Uncle Irving presiding over the service, in the Bronx and teaching them how to do it. There are a lot of young people who would love to do this, but don't know where to start.
Or had Uncle Irving doing it in Hebrew for 5 hours, and
right,
they didn't want to do that either.
Yeah, but they didn't understand a word of it, Our whole idea was to try to make this accessible, and one of the things that we've learned is that there's much more of an acceptance, even than 10 years ago. You know, when we traveled for that other book 10 years ago, people would pick us up at the airport and say, "I asked to pick you up at the airport," and they'd sort of say, look around and say, "My son married an Italian girl," you know, and it was sort of, they were defensive and they were kind of uncertain about it. And I think that what has happened is I'd be willing to bet there's not a single person in this room who's Jewish who doesn't have a relative who's married outside. And that's the way of the world today. Now, if the rabbis, in their traditional view, was we're going to not perform these weddings, we're going to hold the line, we're going to discourage these matches, if in fact that worked, if in fact they actually stopped young people from getting married, they'd have a case. But that's not how life works, right? That's not how life works. What it is that they get married anyway. And so our view has always been that the answer is to be more inclusive, not exclusive, to embrace these couples and embrace these young families. And the other thing that's also happened is their parents. I've talked to rabbis. I have a childhood friend who was a rabbi in Chicago, who never did interfaith marriages. And about a year ago, he told me that he started doing them. And the single biggest reason was there were all of these families who had been loyal members of his congregation for 30 years and had helped, you know, build the building fund, and then their kid marries outside, and the rabbi says, "I'm not going to marry your child." I mean, they were offended, and they were upset. And so,
hurt.
And hurt. So there's been, actually see the pattern is very similar to what's happened with gay marriage. That everybody now has someone in their family who's gay, and every Jewish family has someone who's married out, and it's the reality. And it's not an abstraction anymore. It's a real situation, and there's an individual who comes into your family. And this is what happened with us. At one point, you know, my father, who was so upset about my bringing home Cokie, finally said to me, after he got to know her, said, "You know, it'd be a whole lot easier to oppose this match if it wasn't so obvious she's the perfect girl for you."
He still opposed it.
And I think that's what's happened in a lot of families. And that's part of the reason why we want to do the book.
But it's also true that for some people, the whole idea of just, you know, doing a Seder, cooking the meal, setting the table, all of that is intimidating. So this is the most practical how-to book. You know, it's got all of that. How to set the table, where to order a Seder plate, or buy one, or you don't have to buy one. Here's what you can do instead. And here's some recipes. I've put in my recipes, which are the most simple-minded recipes you'd ever want to cook, but they're good. And websites of places to order things like 10 Plagues finger puppets, which I really do not recommend. The children put them on and start playing in the Harosis, and it's disgusting. But some people like them, and all of that. Also, of course, all the songs are there, and links to the sheet music if you don't know how the Haggadah goes, and all of that. But also, when I first wrote that Haggadah, those 40-some years ago, I kept noticing that in all the Haggadahs I was kind of pulling together, that they kept saying you're supposed to tell your children and your children's children and on to the next generations the story of the Exodus.
I mean, that's what Seder means,
right?
to tell it, right?
Well, but you know what? The story of the Exodus is not in the Haggadah.
A lot of them, some of them, but not a lot.
It's really not in the traditional Haggadah. So actually, we've included the story of the Exodus just as a primer, so that is something we've always passed it around ourselves. So this is the most practical, as well as I think it's quite pretty, but it's the most practical book you'd ever want to pick up.
And, you know, we learned all sorts of things researching this book that we didn't necessarily know. You know, I'm a political writer and commentator most of the time. I don't do a lot of research in the Bible. But I found myself reading Exodus quite carefully. And there were part of it that was very familiar. You all know the story of Moses being put in the basket and drawn forth from the water, what the name Moses means, found by the princess, raised in the palace. We all know that part of the story. But then the story gets a little murky because he kills an Egyptian overseer who was abusing his fellow Jews, and he flees, as Exodus says, to an area called Midian. Now, most biblical scholars, I have now learned, I didn't learn this at Bayonne, New Jersey in Hebrew school, but I know it now. Most biblical scholars think Midian was in what's now Saudi Arabia.
He could have stopped there.
I mean, I don't know that God got this right. I mean, oil, milk, and honey. Oil, milk, and honey. Big choice there. You know that old joke, if we really were the chosen people, why didn't God send us to Kuwait, right? So he's in Midian, and he comes upon, he's at a well, and there are this group of sisters who come to draw water from the well, and they are harassed by a group of shepherds. And Moses chases away the shepherds, and these young women go back home to their father Jethro and say, you know, we met this guy down by the well. And Jethro is appalled and says, so you didn't invite him to dinner? You know? And of course this story is the origin of one of the most important commandments in all of Judaism, which is, of course, is eat something. And they finally do invite Moses, and he comes and, of course, marries one of the sisters, Zipporah. Now, let's start with the fact that Zipporah certainly was not Jewish. She was in Midian, right? And in most legends, she's depicted as a woman of color. So you talk about a mixed marriage here, that she was not Jewish, she was probably one of color. And this is Moses, right? So I take great comfort in this, that this was very much a part of the Passover story from the beginning. And he spends 40 years tending his father-in-law Jethro's flocks. And then, of course, God appears in the burning bush and says, you've got to come back to Egypt and liberate your people. By the way, we want to thank our new press agent, Hosni Mubarak, for demonstrating the universality of the Passover story. But the end of the story is kind of is a little queasy because as they have a son, Zipporah and Moses have a son named Gershom. Now in Exodus, Moses is asked, why did you name this child Gershom? Because Gershom means a stranger there. That's what the name means. And he said, well, I named him that because, famous phrase, I was a stranger in a strange land. And that's the origin of the fact that one of the great traditions of Passover that we take a lot of comfort in is that from the very beginning, the idea of welcoming strangers and inviting outsiders to your seders comes from that phrase in Exodus of Moses' journey. And as they're returning to liberate the Jews from Egypt, Zipporah realizes Gershom is not circumcised. And she's very nervous about this, because how can Moses come back and lead the Jewish people with a son who's not circumcised? So, as described in Exodus, she takes a sharp rock and does the deed before they get back to Egypt. But all of these stories are in this book. Even for people who are familiar with the Passover Seder, there are all these references that you sort of read every year, but how many people here know who Rabbi Tarfon is, right? Every year we read his name. I always thought he was a Japanese car, The new Tarfon, get one, And turns out he was a great Jewish sage of the first century, and this book, in this great Talmudic tradition, we have all these commentaries, explains everything, all of these references we've all read all these years, and we never knew what they meant. Book will tell you.
Well, and of course, there are also so many Christian echoes of Passover, particularly in the Easter liturgy. I've written a little introduction from a Christian perspective, so that that people who are Christians can feel much more comfortable and see the similarities. When we were living in Greece, the word Pascha means both Passover and Easter in Greek, and of course Greek Easter is the big holiday there. And the custom is to walk home from the church. You're supposed to be able to walk. And there was a Greek Orthodox church right a block away from us. So one Easter we did take the kids there, and it's a beautiful service. And then we walked home with our lit candles. And then you take the candle and you make a mark on your doorpost. So it is directly out of Exodus with the putting the blood of the lamb on the doorpost for the angel to pass over. And it turned out, I mean, I knew all of the sort of references of the Paschal lamb and the Paschal sacrifice and all of that, and I knew that the Last Supper was a Seder. But what I didn't know was that the rabbis mentioned in the Seder were very influential in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So Hillel, who was earlier, had really created a whole theological school, and Jesus and his disciples were very much part of that school. And then Hillel's grandson, Gamaliel, who we always reference in the Seder. In fact, when I first typed it out, I had a typo, and he was Rabbit Gamaliel. But he was Hillel's grandson, and he was St. Paul's teacher. And Paul actually referenced him a lot, and when he was out talking to people that he was proselytizing with, and said, you know, I'm a good Jew. I am a student of Gamaliel. So there are all these references that I didn't know about and that I found very interesting, and I think, again, helped to make the whole Haggadah more accessible to those who are not Jewish. But having said that, it is not at all our intention in any way to Christianize or baptize the Seder. This is a Jewish holiday, and it is celebrated by Jews all over the world and has been for thousands of years, sometimes at great personal peril to the people who are celebrating it. But I do think that to understand that it is a holiday that does have universal themes that are directly echoed in the Easter liturgy of going from bondage to freedom, from darkness to light, from death to life, is really what it is all about, and that is universal. But we found, and it was something that we found really meaningful when we were doing some of this research, a letter from the United States Catholic bishops in talking about the similarity and the cooperation that should exist among Christians and Jews. And they said, we must accept our responsibility to prepare the world for the coming of the Messiah by working together for social justice, respect for the rights of persons and nations, and for social and international reconciliation. To this we are driven, Jews and Christians, by the command to love our neighbor, by a common hope for the kingdom of God, and by the great heritage of the prophets. So it is in that spirit that we love to celebrate this wonderful feast, in the spirit of love for our fellow man and hopes that we have taught our children social justice, and that we can all keep at it in our efforts to be good people as we celebrate next year in Bethesda.
Yes. You know, as Cokie says, Passover is a Jewish holiday, but the message of Passover is a universal message. It's a universal message, and we just were reminded of that, you know, in Egypt just a few weeks ago. This is a universal human aspiration to be free from bondage, and one of the things we tried to do is understand that in this little book. There are a lot of readings from all sorts of figures who, not necessarily Rabbi Gamliel, but there's Cesar Chavez and Pope John and Susan B. Anthony and a number of other figures. If you want to read them, you can. You don't have to use them in the Seder, but we wanted to point out that this is not just a Jewish aspiration and a Jewish story. It's a human story, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks a lot.